Okay, we are going to go ahead and get started. I think we do have a couple of people still getting their seats, so if somebody is in front of you, don't worry, they'll be seated soon. Welcome to the session. We are going to be talking about developing HTML5 applications in Visualforce. Just to level set a little bit, I'm going to assume this is a large number of people in the room. How many Visualforce developers do I have in front of me right now? Okay, excellent. If you are not raising your hand, you're in that minority. There's going to be some demos towards the end, which you can kind of still get a lot of enjoyment factor out of. But I am assuming that you know Visualforce before we start talking about like some of the specifics about how to get HTML5 properly into it. And also to be kind of specific about HTML5, because I've always kind of thought that there's nothing really more non-standard than an HTML standard, right? For an HTML5 application, what I'm really saying is that we are going to be talking about how to use some of the elements specific to HTML5 for building applications which are targeting modern browsers, right? So latest iterations of Firefox, Chrome, Safari, Internet Explorer, mobile Safari, Android, not necessarily features which are going to be supported in older browsers. Now, of course, this wouldn't be a Salesforce presentation without the Safe Harbor slide. It's Monday, so you've probably only seen this about 4 or 5 times. Safe Harbor basically just says that if you're going to make any purchasing decisions, please make them based on current features and not any future-looking statements I might make. I don't have anything in the current presentation that should be future-looking, but sometimes it comes up in the Q&A. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Joshua Burke. I'm a developer evangelist with Salesforce.com. Developer evangelist is just a fancy way of saying that I hope we have happy developers and that I have more of them tomorrow. You can catch me on Twitter at Josh Burke, and it's a really good way to reach out to me, actually. I find that my inbox kind of turns into priority nightmare sometimes, so it's a lot easier for me to respond quickly on Twitter. And I do often tell people that I am available for children's parties as long as your child wants to hear about the Salesforce One platform. So like I was saying, will the real HTML5 please stand up, right? Like how are we actually defining HTML5 applications these days? Personally, I think that this is a question that you shouldn't get too bogged down in, right? Focus on the features that you want to do and the features that you're trying to leverage for your users and your customers, and leverage those features in a wide variety of ways. One of the great things about the Salesforce One platform is that it allows you to do it in a way that you can leverage for both for desktop and mobile interfaces. And me personally, I really like this graph because I think it is an honest depiction of how HTML5 development has kind of gone over years. So this is the hype cycle, right? At one point, everybody thought that HTML5 was the future, it was going to kill native, nobody's ever going to do native application development ever again. At one point, Apple's like, you don't even need to create native applications, everybody can just do web applications, and we kind of saw how that worked out. And recently, we've had some people who have like flipped from HTML5 to native, and every time that hits the press, and we kind of get down into the trough of disillusionment there. I personally think that right now, expectations for HTML5 have actually turned very realistic, and so has the tool set. We've got a really good browser set. The browser set has a wide variety of choices that are generally accepted across multiple browsers and multiple platforms. So now's a really good time to get into HTML5 development. So today we're going to highlight some key features of Visualforce, things that have been around for a while. Some of these things are really new. One of them just went GA in our last summer release. But they're things that if you're going to do specifically HTML5 features in a browser that you should know that Visualforce supports. And then I'm going to walk through 3 different HTML demonstrations, show you the code that drives those, and then we'll take some Q&A. So everybody here knows, well, the 99% of you who raised your hand, that Visualforce is basically just a container for rendering HTML. So you can bring in your own JavaScript, you can bring in your own CSS. It will try to render things for you depending on the kind of components that you put down into the page itself. And it has come a long, long way, right? When I first started using Visualforce, like 1.0, there was actually a bug in it that if you didn't space your script correctly, like you used a greater than symbol and you just didn't put any white spaces in, you're nodding your head, you know which one I'm talking about, don't you? It would render it as a data component. And in the middle of your JavaScript, you would get an error that Visualforce shoved into your middle of your JavaScript. Your source looked fine and everything looked fine, and until you looked at the rendered source code, you didn't realize why your application was completely broken. That was Visualforce like 1.0. Now Visualforce is really good about getting out of your way and trying to let you bring in the JavaScript, CSS, and HTML that you want, and tries to give you a fine level of control with what you really can do with the page. And what we're seeing here is really a complete page attribute, which says, just let me do everything I want. The first one to point out is doc type. This isn't terribly new, but it's very important if you're going to do specific HTML5 features, or some of them like HTML5 manifest will not even appear. It just won't work unless you specify an HTML5 doc type. And I don't know, I think about a year and a half ago, 2 years, Visualforce insisted on one specific kind of doc type. I think it was like XHTML4 or something like that. Now you can override the doc type itself. This is going to give you the full range of HTML5 features. You can also tell it now, apply HTML tag or apply body tag either true to false. So if you know you're going to set up your headers in a specific way, you know you're going to set up your body a specific way, an excellent example of why you may want to do this, for instance, there are some times where there's some performance tips, for instance, of putting scripts into like the body of the tag or things like that. Depending on how you set up Visualforce, Visualforce may try to shove those back up in the header, right? In this case, you're like, don't try to render the HTML tag, don't try to render the body tag. I'm going to be in complete control over how I want the page to render. And this is also not a terribly new feature. I think this actually came out, I believe it was summer 13. It's been out for about a year, but it's actually one of the ones that's become more and more important if you're using pre-existing Visualforce components especially, and you're going to start to try to intermingle them with frameworks like, for instance, like Angular. So what we can do with HTML5 is we can actually do custom attributes, which are going to be attributed to div tags, span tags, table rows, table data. And they have a variety of roles. They may be telling the framework how it's supposed to work, like that this div is actually supposed to be rendered as a specific page, or maybe the div is supposed to be rendered as a specific modal or something like that. Sometimes it's actually used for actual data. Like you could put an ID field into this that actually is separate from how we're going to bind it down from Visualforce. And back in the day, Visualforce was extremely persnickety about the kinds of things that you could throw into the component. And to be honest, it still is. But now, if you do HTML dash, it assumes what you're trying to do is an HTML5 attribute pass-through. And so you can see here with the output panel, you're in control over how those HTML5 attributes are going to be laid out within the component, and how it's actually going to get rendered down on the page is how we see here. So it basically strips that HTML dash out from the beginning, and the rest of it is going to persist down to your HTML layer. So here we've got just panel and menu, but remember we could also be binding that back up to Apex level variables as well. Okay, if you have seen me talk about JavaScript in like the last 2 years, you have probably heard me talk about JavaScript promoting. It is something that I am a huge proponent for, especially if you're an HTML5 developer, you're a JavaScript developer, know it, learn it, love it, use it. This is the basic setup. What it allows us to do is take a static method up in Apex and annotate it with remote action. That static method can either be global or public. If it's public, it can't be used in a couple of places, and those are laid out in the documentation. The two that come to mind are like page layouts, like if you're embedding a Visualforce component within a standard page layout, and I believe also dashboards. If you are using it as like a tab or a Salesforce 1 application or something like that, then you can just use the public scope. And there's a lot of people, who, if you're doing managed packages and things like that, they prefer public over global. So once we have annotated that with remote action, what it's going to do is it's going to get exposed directly down to JavaScript. Now this long form that we see here with the visualforce.remoting.manager.invoke action, this is our preferred best practice now for using JavaScript remoting down on the client. The reason for that is that it resolves namespace issues. For instance, if you were to package this with a managed package and then try to sell it up on the App Exchange, the remote action variable that you see there would help resolve any namespace conflicts that might occur from that. If you are just writing it for yourself and your customers and you know that you're not going to worry about that, you can actually just focus, if you see the contact extension .make contact, that will actually work as well. So as long as the Visualforce page has a reference to either a controller or extension with that method annotated, it's going to be exposed directly down to JavaScript. And the way it works is that you can send up the same parameters, and then what we have is we have an asynchronous function that's a callback. And so when Apex is ready with the data, it will call the function, it will send the result down in JSON, and you also get the event object. And the event object is going to include things like messages and errors and things like that. So if something goes wrong with the transaction, you can look at the event object and actually predictably do something like tell the user that their socket was wrong or something like that. Now, why am I a big fan of JavaScript promoting, and why do I talk about it almost all the time? One of the big reasons is because, especially if we are people who have learned Visualforce over the years and we've learned to kind of use the traditional components and the data binding with that, and we use Apex form, we take Apex form and we use that to take our data up to the server. Anytime you put Apex form onto a Visualforce page, you are instantly getting along with it something called a view state. So second question, how many people know what a view state is? Okay, that is actually a slightly higher percentage than I usually get when I ask that question. If you did not raise your hand, do not feel bad. You are in not only broad company, but good company. Part of the reason is because we actually abstract out what the view state is doing to a considerable extent with Visualforce so that you don't necessarily have to worry about it. What a view state does is it solves a very simple problem of HTTP and HTTPS. HTTP, HTTPS is stateless, right? It's kind of like an amnesia person. So if you generate a page and then you do a post back and then you take a result, the page that grabs that result by default actually knows nothing about this original page. It's kind of like the guy from Memento, right? He does not remember what happened 5 minutes ago. And so to do something like a re-render would be very difficult if you're dealing with an amnesiac. So what a view state does is it's basically like that Polaroid photo from Memento, right? It retains what is going on, and the photos are being passed from client to server, and the changes that occur. So when you do a re-render, what happens is there's a view state, it goes up to the server makes the changes, passes it back down to the client sees the changes, and then re-renders the HTML based on that. And it's good, right? Like that's an interesting problem, and it's a good way to solve that problem. And so if you're using form tag and you're using a bunch of re-renders and your page is working fine, I am not saying go and just start ripping it all out and start putting JavaScript promoting in instead. What I am saying is that what that view state does is it gets bigger and bigger the more data you bind down to the client. And the more data you bind down to the client is going to go from the client to the server to the client to the server, and it does not matter how small of a transact that you're trying to do. Like maybe the Apex only cares about one variable. Doesn't matter. All the data that's in the view state is going to go up and it's going to come back down. So classic use case scenario, if you're trying to do a data table, like you're drawing your own data table, you've got like 500 records on that data table, it's going to be 500 times, well, not 500 times slower, but your view state is going to be like 500 times bigger. Like as that data table gets bigger and bigger and bigger, the view state is going to start working against you. JavaScript promoting doesn't need it. That's why that method is static in the first place, right? All it's doing is getting an answer, getting a question, returning an answer. It gets a question, returns an answer. JavaScript handles the rest. So I've taken pages which have really long data lists and lots of records and things like that, and when you're doing those little transactions, like just update one field, update one record, you can get 5, 6, 7 times the performance in return, and the interface stays performant. So the longer your page gets, the performance does not actually change. So I've been called a view state hater. It's not true. I'm just on a mission to let people know that it exists, what it does to your page, and this is one way to work around it. Now we just saw that it has direct integration with JavaScript. My second pulpit point that I'm going to make with JavaScript promoting is that it does not, and this is obviously true of the Apex form itself, this is not unique to that, but as we get into some forms of JavaScript development, it gets to be attractive to attempt to do things like contact the REST API to get a result back. JavaScript promoting does not require the use of the API because it's directly within the Visualforce scope from Apex back down to Visualforce. And my strong recommendation to Visualforce developers is that if you are in the scope of Visualforce, do not enter the scope of the API unless you absolutely have to. Obviously, there's some cases, like if you're doing a streaming API solution or something like that, there's no other way to do it. The streaming API is the only solution for that. But the thing is, Visualforce shouldn't need to access the REST API to do data transactions. It just shouldn't have to do it. And your users should be able to just pound on the Visualforce page day in and day out without consuming any API request. So just as a best practice, JavaScript remoting, stay out of the API scope. Now, this one I'm very happy to talk about. And I'm very happy that it went generally available this last summer release. This is actually, it's one of the few features in the platform that I feel like I have kind of a personal attachment to. Remote objects actually started in this really weird way. I was having a conversation with like my boss's boss, and then like 2 other guys on the Visualforce team were having conversations with their bosses, and then our bosses were talking to other, like whatever bosses do when they get together, and they realized that these guys are all talking about the exact same thing. And then like one of those guys like sent me an email, and they're like, "You're talking about this." And I'm like, "Yeah, it's a good idea." And they're like, "We think so too." So everybody started to realize this was a good idea, and so a lot of inertia started getting behind the concept. And so I've been able to kind of watch it grow. And so it's actually, if you guys ever see Chris Wall or Varun Dadla, buy them a beer. Because there's 2 of the guys who are personally really actually responsible for getting this out the door and really championing it behind the scenes here at Salesforce. Now, what remote objects is going to do is solve the same kind of problem that we see with like standard controller. And that was actually where the conversation started. Standard controller, the whole idea is that we don't want you to do any more work than you absolutely have to. If you're doing the basic create, read, update, delete, search functionality, why do you have to write Apex for that? It's going to look 99% the same. Between an account and a contact and an opportunity and a custom object, that code is always going to look almost exactly the same. And the difference, right, that like 1 to 5% difference between those objects, we can guess that because we know what your data model looks like. We have all the metadata. We know exactly what your data model looks like. So standard controller is an awesome thing, and it saves people so much time. And we're looking at JavaScript promoting, and we're like, why do we have the same thing for JavaScript promoting? Why can't JavaScript promoting do that? Why are we forcing developers to write the exact same Apex over and over and over again just to do a simple query, just to do a simple update, just to do a simple create? And our response was, we shouldn't. We shouldn't be doing that. And so the idea behind remote objects is that it gives you that baseline create, read, update, delete in a JavaScript library that has data transport right back up to the server, and you don't have to code any Apex for it. So here we see the overall remote objects, and then we see the remote object model. I give it an S object name. I can give it a JavaScript shorthand. And then those fields are actually bound. So if you put a field that doesn't exist, Visualforce will tell you you're trying to create a data library that doesn't exist. And then what I get is a client-side data model that I can use to then talk directly up to the data layer. So I actually right now, and this actually occurs with some of the demos that we're about to see here, I'm in a process of going through and actually ripping out a bunch of old JavaScript promoting because tons of demos that I did were like 4 Apex methods long. It was always search something, create a record, update a record, delete a record. Don't even need them anymore. Don't even need them anymore. And it keeps a lot of the development very pure on the JavaScript HTML5 side as opposed to having to go up and have some nearly duplicate Apex to get the same job done. So what are the benefits of remote objects? Basically the exact same thing. No view state direct integration, no use of the API scope. However, we are also now in the business of not having to write baseline Apex just to get our job done. Okay, so enough talking. Let's do some demos. This first one is kind of a straightforward one. I put this one in because I think even though it's not like the most exciting use case in the world, I think it is one that is very common for Visualforce developers to have to do. It's just basically getting an input, getting a form, using HTML5 components. But in this case, what I'm going to be able to do is I'm actually going to be able to use remote objects. So what we're going to look at, placeholders, specific types, and some autofocus. And we're also going to focus on a use case which is pretty, I think, pretty common. It comes up a lot, right? So here I am. And let me get to my developer console. Okay, and then this is the actual page. You can see this is almost right from the slide, right? So I'm telling Visualforce, don't use anything standard. Let me do the HTML tag. Let me do the body tag. I'm going to use the doc type. And then if we go down to my actual form, I'm keeping it really, really, really simple, right? Just input. And then what the placeholder is going to do, that's an HTML5 attribute that allows me to just notice there's no labels. The reason there's no labels is because the placeholder text will appear in the input field for me when I actually show the form first. And when you click on it, it just disappears. Kind of like a lot of search buttons will have like search here for it. Now, one little kind of quirk of Visualforce, I'm giving it so many good props about like how it keeps trying to get out of your way and it keeps trying to be HTML friendly, it keeps trying to be JavaScript friendly. This one's a little weird. If we focus right here, so autofocus is an HTML5 attribute which makes it just very easy. Don't do any like jQuery blur stuff or anything like that. That'll be the first input field that's focused when the person brings up the page. However, if you go to actual HTML5 documentation, it's just the word autofocus. It's just an attribute that just says autofocus. So when you see this in docs for HTML5, it will look like that. The problem is Visualforce still doesn't like that. It's like, what are you doing? Like, I don't know what's on the component, and it gets confused. And Visualforce is very cranky when it's confused. And so it will argue that you have to set it to something. And so you can set it to true. I can type true correctly. You can set it to true, and both HTML5 and Visualforce will be happy at this point. I highlight this mostly because it occurs in a few other places too. Like, I don't know if anybody's played with defer or async on script tags. Same thing. Just do defer equals true, it will still do defer, it will still do async, and Visualforce will stop complaining about it. So we have some basic HTML5 here. We're also using a type equals file because one of the questions that comes up a lot is how do I do an image within like Salesforce 1, right? Salesforce 1 doesn't have like Cordova where we can do photo access kind of thing from a PhoneGap point of view, but HTML5 actually does allow it to do this. And I should be honest here, this is an evolution from a demonstration that a colleague of mine, Pat Pedersen and Samantha Reddy did called the Boogie Woogie app. So if anybody's familiar with that demo, you may be familiar with the next trick that we're doing here, which is a basic, sorry, that's the wrong section. Oh, no, that's the right section. So in order to grab the image, what we're doing is we're using a JavaScript file reader on the side. So the flow here is generate the HTML5 input fields. When the user clicks on the file, it's going to go through this handler. And when it's an image, JavaScript is going to handle the image data. And then it's going to actually, and I'm using jQuery here, then to go ahead and render that. So let me show you that from just an HTML point of view. Very basic. So the use case here is like you're at a conference. Like that happens from time to time. And you want somebody who can run up to somebody on a phone and just register them really quickly, right? So I've got my phone, and I've got Salesforce 1, and I want to be able to just put in their basic information and then click a button and then be done with it. And so if I actually put this into, I'll show you what I'm showing on my phone here so that there's no bells and whistles. So I pull in here. HTML5 is going to be pulling in that input field for me. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put in some name here. Demo. Email. And then I'm going to take a picture. I'm going to try the world's largest selfie here. Hold a second. All right. Do selfie thing. Okay, everybody in the front row wave. We'll do it like this. Oh gosh, that's it. Okay, that slightly hurt actually. Okay, I'm going to use that photo. And so, since this is not, so we'll do here, we'll do Mr. Leo Dreamforce and Leo at demo.com. And so what I can actually do, just to kind of show you the interface that you can't see because my phone is really tiny, if I put my little headshot in here instead, it's just going to pop up here as a quick preview. And then when I hit submit here, assuming nothing goes horribly wrong, it'll just blank that out for me. So I've got the same selfie here, well, different selfie. So we'll hit submit, and people in the front row can see form has vanished. And now we can go close this out, and we can go back in here, go back to our contacts, and we'll do Joe demo here. And in this case, what I've actually done, this is a rich text field. And so it's just taking the data and it's converting it to what's called a data URL, which is a base64 way of attributing data. And it's creating an image source, and it's putting the source in, and it's putting it in there. When our platform loves attachments, right? So you could do it like this. You could do it as a chatter feed post. You could do it as an attachment. You could put it in a document. At this point, it really kind of depends on just how you associate it. From a remote objects point of view, because if we go back to just show you that aspect, right? So I created my remote objects, I created my model, I said I'm gonna do a contact, I'm gonna do those things there. And then all I need to do is create my contact within JSON, and then that S object is gonna give me the ability to create a blank data model based on the contact, and then just hit create. And once it's created, that's when it actually just blanks everything out. So the entire flow here, and this is what's different from the original like Boogie Woogie demo, entire flow here, no Apex involved. Just some simple remote objects, simple HTML5, simple JavaScript, very easy to do, and yet a very functional, user-friendly form that actually talks back to the system. So forms and images are probably one of the most common questions, like how can we do this kind of thing that I get. One of the second ones is probably how can I make really, really cool graphs? Not just graphs, really cool graphs, like graphs that are really like interesting and highly customized, and they're driven by data and all of this stuff. And it's one of the things when going back to that, like how good is HTML5 these days? This is kind of a good example because I've probably looked at doing dynamic charting like this, I don't know, like a year and a half ago. And to be honest, the JavaScript frameworks just weren't out there, right? Like they just really weren't up to snuff. You could do it, but you're gonna spend a lot of time figuring out like how the framework really works. And they talk to SVG and they talk to Canvas and do a lot of the same stuff that D3 is doing here. They just weren't all that friendly. And now, and we're gonna see this in the third demo, now it is like crazy powerful to do. So D3.js, how many people use D3? Just out of curiosity. Okay. D3.js, data-driven documents, is actually SVG based. It can create, it's not a charting library, right? So you can't tell D3, just give me a bar chart. What you can do is you can tell D3 how to build a bar chart. And it's pretty good at learning how to build a bar chart. But the nice thing about that is that not only can you use it for charting, you can also use it for visualizations like we're gonna see here. And so it's really good at arcs and curves and splines and all these things. And it's very good at you create the basic structure of what D3 is supposed to draw, and then you throw data at it. And it's really good at reading that data and then being able to display itself. In this next demo, we're not going to see the transitions and events. We'll see that a little bit in the third one. But let me bring up, so what I did here, kind of an odd use case. I was having a small argument with my internet service provider, who through reasons I will not name, they're based in Chicago, so you probably have not heard of them. And I kept saying my internet's really, really slow. And they kept saying, no, it's not. I'm like, yes, it is. And they're like, it's probably your modem. And I'm like, I don't think it's true. Because sometimes it's really fast. And other times, it's not really fast. And I'm not sure if you're familiar, because you live in like the Bay Area, you guys have like awesome internet just like all over the place, and it's like 5 pennies an hour or whatever. But cable works like this. You get neighborhood broadband, which means if this neighbor is using a bunch of bandwidth, you're not. And if you have a lot of neighbors, then you just don't have any bandwidth whatsoever. And a lot of now I'm not saying cable is bad. A lot of service providers know how to get around that. Mine didn't. So what I did is I actually used a Python script that converted speed test data into JSON. And then what I'm doing here is taking that JSON data and I'm converting it into a custom object. And then I'm going to use the custom object with remote objects, and I'm going to throw that to D3 in this page here. And so I bring in jQuery, which is just for utility functions. I bring in D3. I bring in Plum is actually a library I'm working on, which it's just map reduction. basically, because I'm going to throw out a bunch of data, but I really just care about the key value pairs it's getting reduced to. And then I'm going to point remote objects up to my custom object. And the reason why I wanted to show you, I could have technically, and I had an earlier version that worked like this, I could have technically just pointed at the JSON, but I specifically wanted to show this to highlight something how remote objects work. So remote objects like to start with a limit of 100 rows. So if we go back to that use case where it's like you've got like 500 records in a data list or something like that you're trying to do, you can do that, but what it really wants you to do is it wants you to go through a pagination structure. And so the pagination structure is using offset, right? So we start with an offset of 100, and we start with a limit of 100, and then we get our first records down. We increase the offset by another 100, and that's just going to, on the remote object side, you don't even have to worry about the SOCL query. On the remote object side, it's going to recreate the SOCL query correctly for you, and then you just paginate up the query. And when we finally get no results back whatsoever, we know that we're done in our pagination, and then we can display our data. And I won't go into too much of the woods. We could actually do a whole demo or a whole session on D3 itself. But basically, you tell it what SVG you want it to produce. And I know this looks very, very long, but there's some really great blog articles about how to generate splines and curves and things like that. So I'm going to pull this up and then I'm going to rerun it because I want to show you in the JavaScript console. But you can see it's basically a 24-hour clock. And when I was sleeping, I got really good speed. I know. Like San Francisco, like 10, you're like, that's not fast. That's all they would give me. They would just give me 10. So 10 was what I was paying for. And if I was working and trying to game and stuff at like 5 in the morning, then it would have been fine because everybody else is asleep. But then everybody comes home around 5 o'clock and I start to try to watch Netflix, and so does everybody else in my neighborhood. And you can see it starts slowing down. And eventually around the 8 o'clock point, this is 3. This was actually optimistic at the worst of this scenario. It was like 0.5 or something like that. And I showed this, the engineer came over to quote unquote fix my modem. And I showed him this graph and he's like, I know exactly what the problem is, and he left. So visualization is good because sometimes you can convince your internet service provider that they need to go fix their problem. So if we look at this, I'm going to reload this. So I want to show you that data actually coming down the pipe. Right, so bloop, bloop, right? So there's like 597 objects or data points that it's actually pulling down. It'll just keep pulling those down, and then it will map reduce them, and then it will throw them over to D3, and then it will generate it on here. So for the last trick, it's kind of an evolution off of both of those. This is actually, this is an evolution of a demo that another fellow of mine, Peter Chittum, did for reveal.js. Reveal.js is a framework whose pure only job, and this is another really great example of like how HTML5 is really kind of evolving for us as developers. This was another one I looked at about a year ago, and the frameworks out there just were not very developer friendly, to be quite honestly. Reveal is very friendly, and Reveal has one task. It wants to take your divs and your sections, and it wants to convert it into a presentation that you could actually show somebody and do it in a very easy way. But as HTML5 developers, that gives us the ability to do that in a custom dynamic setting. I can bind data down to those divs and those sections so that I don't have to, the use case Peter was using here was, let's say you're going to be presenting more or less the same concept about 5 different accounts. Instead of going into PowerPoint and doing 5 different presentations on 5 accounts, do one reveal and bind the data to each one of those accounts. And then you have a dynamic presentation based on the data that you have in Salesforce. But one of the tricks that I did to kind of show Peter up a little bit, and also because I thought it was really cool, so I wanted to be able to call it out to you guys, is this project called C3.js. C3 is prepackaged D3 charts. So if you did want to do a bar chart or a line chart or a pie chart or something like that, this is actually like just make me a bar chart and then throw data at it and you'll have a baseline bar chart in a very nice, interactive, HTML5 friendly kind of way. So if I go here, go back to this. And the other thing I want to call out here, notice at the top we're using standard controllers again. All right, I've been talking about how great JavaScript promoting is, talking about how great remote objects are and things like that, and you're like, standard controller is so old school, but the thing is it does everything we need here. It's only read-only. I don't need the data transport back and forth. I don't need a client-side data model. I could do this in remote objects, but it's like 5 times more code, even if it's on the client side. So the lesson here is don't, like, even though I'm trying to show you guys like new things in different ways, it doesn't mean that everything that Visualforce has been doing, we just throw it out of our toolkit. Standard controller does everything we need here. Notice also Peter actually has it set up as templates. So he's using Visualforce templates to set up some of the baseline CSS and JavaScript, and then he's just putting the presentation itself within the template. So all the old tricks that we knew how to do in Visualforce still apply. And a lot of those are going to get the job that we want done. And here, every time we see, so classes slides tells us reveal, this is our actual presentation, and then we have the HTML5 component section, and the section is going to split it off into the actual slides, and then we just use standard controller to bind it back up to both the account as well as opportunities and contacts. And then what I've done here is I've just embedded a chart ID, and C3 is going to throw the bar chart that I want right into that div. So now, I'm going to try this in PowerPoint. Now I'm going to have an interactive chart in the middle of my presentation. So if we preview that, now preview's not going to really work. Let's close him out. Let's go to accounts. Close view, go to Burlington here, because I know that's got all the data I want. Click this. That's going to open it up in a completely new page. And now I have this presentation on Burlington. And the other thing that Reveal does is it pulls in CS3 transitions. So not only is it it's not just shoving them into squares, it actually allows us to kind of have this nice PowerPoint look and feel to it. If I want to move over to another key point, it does this nice little flow thing. And another trick that you can do here that you can't do easily in PowerPoint, I can even dig down. So we can have not just one level, but we can actually have a second level. So I can go back and forth between that. And then here, this is the chart that we've created within D3. You can see if I hover over here, I've got all the interactive elements here. This is actually dummy data, because the dummy data looked better than the real data I was trying to put in there. But anyway, and then if we go here, we have contacts, and then we can bring up, and I could have actually done this with the first application and add this to the contact record and then pull it into the presentation that we see, because we can just pull in any data we want from Salesforce and then show it into the presentation itself. So 3 varied examples, some key points on how to get those up and running. And we have 3 minutes left, if I'm reading the clock correctly. So first of all, thank you everybody for coming. It's awesome talking to you. And does anybody have any questions? Yes? I believe you mean lightning. I actually owe Mike Rosenbaum $1 every time I say the word aura, so I can't respond the way. So lightning is going to be a whole new stack. And the idea behind lightning is, and it's going to be very HTML5 friendly, because all those tricks we had to do, you don't even have to do that. It never assumes that you want to have the page rendered in a Visualforce friendly way. And the other idea behind lightning is that lightning is the same stack that we're doing the rest of our interface layer in. Whereas Visualforce has to be done through iframes and other tricks like that. Yeah. So there's going to be Visualforce development and Lightning development. There's going to be times where you really kind of want to use Lightning because you can do that trick of putting it in the same interface, but they're going to be running alongside for a while. Right. Yep. Yep. Yes. Yeah, so we actually did a bunch of tests. So the question is, do we recommend remote objects with like Angular and other similar frameworks? We actually did a lot of testing with, there's a demo out there from Varun actually using Angular. We did a lot of testing with Bootstrap, Backbone, Angular. I did a CanJS demo because we wanted to make sure remote objects was friendly with those kind of frameworks because it's really kind of designed for them. Basically what you see is you have the remote objects version of the client-side model, and you'll have the Angular version of the client-side model, and they just sort of talk next to each other. Yep. Any other questions? Okay.